parable that we're going to look at tonight is the parable of the unjust steward. So if you will turn to Luke chapter 16 and whatever your favorite form of Holy Scriptures might be, and we're going to start out with the first 7.5 verses of Luke 16. Now he was also saying to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager. The manager said to himself, what shall I do? Since my master is taking the management away from me, I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I will do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. And he summoned each one of his master's debtors. And he began saying to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, and how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. And his master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. A lot of people are really bothered by the ethics that seem to be implied in this parable. The manager is obviously a devious, scheming scoundrel. And yet his methods are commended by his master and indirectly by Jesus in the telling of this story. But at this point, I'd like to remind you something that Ryan said in his introductory lesson to this series a couple of months back. Jesus did not tell parables primarily to teach moral lessons. He taught in parables primarily to help people see the world the way he sees it. And I think that's what we have at play in this parable that we're looking at tonight. As we search for Jesus' purpose, it's helpful to note that chapter 16 in Luke follows a pattern that is characteristic for several chapters in this section of the book. First of all, we have a cluster of parables and sayings that are focused on a common theme. And so in chapter 16, the recurring theme that we see here is Jesus teaching about wealth and material possessions. First, we have this parable of the shrewd manager. And then down in verse 14, we have this comment about the Pharisees who loved money. Luke threw that in there just to point out how that story fit into his theme here. And finally, we have the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. But all of these around this theme of the management, the stewardship of wealth. And with that, let's take a closer look at this parable of the dishonest manager. We're introduced to two principal characters, a certain rich man and his steward, or manager, who was responsible for administering his estate. The Greek word that is variously translated manager or steward is the word oikonomos. That's where we get our English word economy. Okay? It literally means house ruler. And it's a broad term for an employee or an agent who is entrusted with the management of his employer's money and property. We might compare it to our concept of a power of attorney. It was the manager's prerogative, even his duty, to buy, sell, trade, and invest his master's wealth with little or no direct oversight. His job description had one line on it: to increase his master's wealth by all legal or even quasi-legal means. A steward was paid on commission based on the income that he earned for his master's estate. But as was so often the case in the Roman world at the time of Christ, it was this way with tax collectors, but it was this way with other people as well, like stewards. anything that this steward could bring in over and above his master's prescribed rate of return would go straight into the steward's private purse. Okay? Now, that may not meet the standards of what we would exactly call ethical in our day and time, but so far as it went back then, it was all entirely legal. And recognizing this manager's surcharge, if we want to call it that, is one key to understanding this parable. So keep that in mind. So the crucial issue in the parable was not that the steward was lining his pockets with excessive interest and surcharges and so forth extracted from his master's debtors. The problem was that he was squandering his master's own wealth. The Greek word translated squandering usually means to scatter or to disperse, such as in the parable of the sower. The farmer scattered the seeds. That's the same word there is translated here, squandering. Or it could be the idea of dispersal of an unruly mob by riot police, something like that. But figuratively, this word could mean to waste, to poof off, as my daddy used to say. It's the same word used to describe the actions of the prodigal son who squandered his money in wild living that we read about in chapter 15. So the problem was that the steward, not content with his contracted wages plus whatever extra income that he could scout from his master's debtors, was somehow cooking the books to dip into his master's own personal funds. Could have been a case of straight embezzlement, or it could have been a matter of using his master's money instead of his own to indulge his personal vices, gambling, prostitutes, or what have you. It doesn't really matter because, after all, this is a parable, and such details as that are not really pertinent to the main point of the story. The point is that the steward had been misappropriating his master's wealth. He got caught, and he got fired. So what's he going to do now? It's too weak for manual labor, too proud to beg. So the steward hatches a scheme to sustain his easy lifestyle, living in wealthy people's houses and eating at wealthy people's tables and so forth, after he lost his job. And this is a scheme that Jesus describes in verse 8 as shrewd. The Greek word there is phronimos. It means wisely or with insight. In our jargon, we would say that the steward used his head. All right? So he calls in his master's debtors and inquires from each one how much they owe. We're given a sample of two debtors here. The idea we get, the feeling is that these are just two representatives of probably a long line of debtors that will all be treated in the same way. And he says, how much do you owe my master? And the amounts were huge. These are not petty debts of poor people. They're not a matter of borrowing seed grain on the part of small-scale farmers. The cash value of the commodities that were owed by these debtors to the master come out to about 16 months' wages for a common day laborer. So they were in to the master for a lot. The master appears to have been something of a venture capitalist, investing large amounts of money into promising agricultural and or commercial enterprises in return for high rates of return. And by the way, that in itself was contrary to the law of Moses. There really aren't any good guys in this parable, okay? They're all scoundrels. But the legal contracts of indebtedness were always written in the handwriting of the debtor, so that there be no room for accusations of forgery or fraud. You owe my master this much, you got it here in your own handwriting. But the steward, by the authority of his position, can execute and even renegotiate these contracts in the name of his master. Anytime he feels like it, or as many times as he can get away with it. And of course, he would always tack on his own surcharge onto each of these transactions. So the steward's scheme for sustaining his cushy lifestyle after he loses his job involves reducing the burden of the debts, of these huge debts to those that owed his master money. So he sits down and he summarily reduces the debt of oil from 100 measures to 50. He says, here, tear this up, you write another one, and just say that you only owe 50. And the debt of 100 measures of wheat is reduced to 80. And what he seems to have done was to cut out his own surcharges. His master would still get back his principal, plus the interest he expected. The steward was sacrificing his own short-term gain with the expectation of receiving greater benefits in the future. Now, I want you to hold on to that thought. Sacrifice short-term gain with the expectation of a greater benefit later on down the road. See, the ancient world ran on a basis of a reciprocity ethic. A favor given demanded a favor returned. Public honor required that these debtors make some kind of appropriate return to their benefactor for the reduction of their huge debts. A return such as, I don't know, welcoming him into their homes and feeding him at their tables. How's that work for you, steward? Oh, that's a good deal. This dishonest steward's clever strategy had given him a claim on his master's debtors that was much more secure than any business contract. And these two debtors, representing, as we said, probably many others, would be forever beholden to this steward. So he has a long line of people here that owe him a debt of gratitude to be shown in terms of housing and food and things like that. He has secured his future. And so when the time comes for him to give an exact account of his management, the soon-to-be ex-steward comes in and hands over the newly revised books to his master. And the master can clearly see, the steward has engineered his own soft landing. But he could also see that he, as the master, had personally lost nothing in all of these transactions. All of his principal, all of his interest, everything that was due to him was coming back to him. And he had no choice other than to tip his hat and commend his ex-steward for taking a lemon and making lemonade. And that's the parable. And what are we supposed to do with it? We have here a case study of a corrupt, scheming shyster with a gift for manipulating the worst of circumstances to his own selfish advantage. And then there's something that just doesn't sit well with us when Jesus commends this steward's actions, backhanded though that compliment may have been. But let's allow Jesus to speak for himself on these matters. Jesus' interpretation or commentary on this parable begins in the middle of verse 8. He said, "For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into eternal dwellings." Okay, that's Jesus' explanation here. There's quite a bit in these couple of verses that we need to unpack. First of all, I don't know about you, I don't like the word shrewd. It sounds sneaky. I think of a shrewd person as somebody with shifty eyes, kind of like the politicians that talked about in the old movie, The Hunt for Red October. You know, they kiss your babies right before they steal their lollipops. You know, that's, to me, that's a shrewd deal. But it may seem unworthy of Jesus' commendation, but we better not forget that this isn't the only time that Jesus uses this word shrewd in his teaching in a positive sense with regard to the motivation and behavior of his disciples. For instance, in Matthew 10 and verse 16, he says, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves." The historical context here in Matthew's verse is the occasion of Jesus sending out his 12 apostles on their first preaching tour. And Matthew uses that same word, phronimos, when he quotes Jesus telling them to be shrewd, wise, mentally acute, to use their heads in difficult and trying circumstances. However, in contrast to the steward, who was unjust or unrighteous, Jesus commands his apostles to be innocent, with no admixture of evil in their shrewdness. They're to be pure, transparent, free from false and unworthy motives. Paul expressed exactly the same idea in different words when he wrote to the Romans. "I want you to be wise in what is good and innocent in what is evil." That's our concept there. And Jesus, I believe, was his own best example of what he's talking about. In numerous encounters with unbelieving Jewish leaders, they were always trying to trap him in his words or to tie him up in seemingly no-win dilemmas and trying to discredit him, only to be sent every time on their way, slack-jawed, with their tails drooping between their legs. My favorite example of this, I think, is again in Luke's Gospel in chapter 20, where they're asking Jesus, is it lawful to pay taxes or not? And the text says that he detected their trickery and said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." And he said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." That was sharp. That was shrewd. He was on top of the situation. He knew exactly what they were trying to do to him, and he wasn't buying it. But he was innocent. He was pure in his motives. He wasn't trying to in any way deceive or to just win a fight with these men. He was trying to teach the truth to them. He was shrewd, but he was pure and innocent in his doing that. Secondly, Jesus notes here that the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. And here it is. This is an example of Jesus using a parable not so much to teach a moral lesson, but to help people see the world in the way that he sees it. And for some reason, Jesus thought that it's harder for the righteous, that is, the sons of life, to be shrewd and innocent than it is for the wicked, the sons of this age, to be shrewd and dishonest. He just says, they're better at being shrewd than you are, my people. And as people in the world give more thought to their physical well-being than the righteous do to their spiritual well-being. And third, in light of that truth, Jesus urged his hearers to make friends for yourselves by the means of wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. And that's again one of those statements that just makes you scratch your head. But here, Jesus brings the parable down to its main point: the shrewd and innocent use of material wealth. This is where he's going with all of this. And he uses an Aramaic word here for wealth, and that word is mammon. We've heard it before. The only other use of it in the New Testament is in Matthew 6:24. That's Jesus' encounter with the rich young ruler. But he seems to use it in both of those texts as almost as a personal name. Mammon with a big M, if you will. Like the name of an idol. And in both of these texts, Jesus makes it clear that wealth is not merely an impersonal medium of exchange. Wealth is not morally neutral. Wealth has the power to rule over our lives if we allow ourselves to become its servants. And the wealth of unrighteousness, as Jesus calls it, can become a power that seeks to dominate us, body and soul. But on the other hand, neither is wealth inherently evil. If it were, then all uses of wealth would be evil and forbidden to the children of the light. But there's a whole host of examples in the New Testament that show us that clearly is not what Jesus has in mind. Look at Zacchaeus, the penitent tax collector, in chapter 19. Or the women who supported Jesus and his disciples during their itinerant ministry. These seem to be women of means, and they use those means for good purposes. Barnabas, the disciple in Jerusalem after the establishment of the church, sold a tract of land that he owned and laid the proceeds of it at the apostles' feet. He probably had other tracts of land that he did not sell or hadn't at that time. Barnabas was a man of means. There was nothing wrong with that, as long as his attitude towards that wealth, towards those means, was proper. So Jesus tells us that wealth is not inherently evil, but it is potentially evil. And he tells us to use the potentially unrighteous wealth in a holy and righteous way. Why? To make friends. Make friends for yourselves with the potentially unrighteous mammon. Now, not friends, you should say, with the world, like the unrighteous steward, but ultimately friends with God. Only God can welcome us into eternal dwellings. The unrighteous steward made friends that would welcome him into their houses that wouldn't last. Jesus says, in the same way, use the unrighteous mammon, if you will, to make friends for yourself who will welcome you into eternal dwellings. Jesus is telling us that God honors those who are generous. And rather than run from it, his people, God's people, are to liberate wealth from the grasp of the devil and repurpose it for the kingdom of heaven. Rather than reject it, we are to conquer mammon, subdue it, and use its power for higher goals. And when the end comes and wealth is irrelevant, the shrewd and innocent ones will be revealed as those who have seen into the future and managed wisely and righteously the resources that God has entrusted to them in the present. They will be the ones who sacrificed the short-term benefits of material wealth in this world with the expectation of receiving a greater benefit in the future. The conclusion of the parable, or at least of this section, is in verses 10 to 13. Jesus says, "He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust the true riches to you? And if you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." Now, based on some literary details that we're not going to go into right now, it seems to me that the parable itself of the dishonest steward ends with verse 9. And verses 10 to 13 appear to have been independent sayings that Luke edited into this context. These are authentic sayings of Jesus that he took from various other contexts and placed them here because they shared certain themes and certain catchwords with the parable and set out its meaning in greater relief. This supplemental section asks two very important questions. First, if you've not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust true riches to you? And secondly, if you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? And then those questions are followed by a self-evident conclusion. You cannot serve God and wealth. Here's the deal. Money is a tool. It can be an extremely valuable resource when put to the right use. It can help to advance the kingdom of heaven, our Master's kingdom, in the midst of this lost and dying world. But to possess money, to possess wealth, is also to hold a sacred stewardship. Our material resources are not to be held and consumed as though they were our own personal possessions. That was the sin of the unrighteous steward in Jesus' parable. Rather, they are to be used to advance the repossession of this fallen world for the God who created it. And these questions in verses 11 and 12 probe our core values. Do we use the resources placed in our trust by God for our own selfish ends or as instruments for advancing the cause of His kingdom in this world? If we cannot manage someone else's wealth that has been entrusted to our care, how can we expect to receive that which is truly our own when our Master returns to take account of our stewardship? Jesus is driving for a character in His disciples that reflects God's integrity and generosity and grace. So the Christian is called to use money without serving it. And the reward for those who are found faithful in the stewardship of God's wealth is stated clearly in the parable of the talents. When the master commended the two faithful stewards in that parable, he said to them, "Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." Matthew Henry was a British churchman of the late 17th, early 18th centuries, a prolific preacher and author, and he wrote a series of commentaries on the biblical texts that are still actually published today. But regarding the stewardship of material wealth, Henry wrote, "He is no fool who parts with that which he cannot keep, when he is sure to be recompensed with that which he cannot lose." And so in the stewardship of material wealth, may we, as God's people, always be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves.